Hi, and today I want to talk about how to practice repetitions on the piano. I think this is one of the few technical subjects that I've never discussed on my channel before. I have made a video on how to play octave repetitions and I used Liszt's Rigoletto as an example for that, but I've never made a video on actual simple repetitions on one key without intervals, without anything else. So today the video will be all about that. So if you're interested in watching my exercises and seeing what I do in order to make the repetitions happen as perfectly as possible, then keep on watching. So as an example today, I used Tchaikovsky's Neapolitan Dance from the Swan Lake, a very famous piece because I think that it is a good piece to demonstrate repetitions. However, first I want to just talk about some general things to look out for when playing repetitions. So the first thing that is probably the most well-known trick, so to speak, is to not use the same finger. Repetitions usually work better when you trick yourself into thinking that you are playing many different keys rather than just repeating the same key and creating that uncomfortable feeling. So if you use a fingering in which you change fingers and don't use the same finger all the time, it will make things easier for you. Probably the most common fingering is 3-2-1. Of course, it totally depends on the structure of your repetition passage. In the passage that I use, the Tchaikovsky passage, 3-2-1 simply makes sense because we always have groups of 3 notes that are being repeated. However, you can also use 4-3-2-1, and you can also use 2-1-2-1, which is also a method that works well for certain people. What is important is that your fingers do a sort of flicking motion, is what I want to call it. Basically, you want to just flick your fingers like that, kind of like strumming the strings of a guitar, maybe. That could be a good comparison. And then let the next finger approach the key. So don't linger, don't lift them back up, but kind of flick them and then have the next finger approach the key. The second important thing to look out for is to not bounce with every finger. So you don't want to have bounce, 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 but rather you want to have one motion per group. So if you have 3-2-1, for example, as a repetition group, then one motion for the 3-2-1, one bounce with 3-2-1, 3-2-1, 3-2-1 per bounce. If you have 4-3-2-1, then 4-3-2-1, 4-3-2-1. You can also practice that by resting your wrist on the other hand. So in this case, my right hand is doing the repetitions. So I can rest the wrist of my right hand on my left hand in order to make sure that it's completely relaxed, and then play the repetitions and make sure that it's one movement, it's one bounce, rested wrist, and not bounce, bounce, bounce. Another finger position trick that you can do is you can move on the key. You can move forwards, you can move backwards. Sometimes I like to move forwards while I'm repeating the notes. Sometimes I like to start quite in the front of the key and then move backwards. It depends on what works better for you, but the movement on the key also creates the suggestion of movement in your brain, and it takes the focus off the repeating aspect and it makes it feel a little more as if you were playing different keys. So generally, just simply technically speaking, these are the 3 most important things to look out for. The flicking motion, don't lift your fingers back up like that. The one bounce per group, and also the free moving on the key in order to make things easier, either moving forward or moving backwards. Another trick that I want to mention is that you can use language, or you can use syllables that you put on each repeated note, especially when you are looking into playing quite fast repetitions. Of course, the danger is that you'll get stuck and you'll actually not play repetitions, but just the same note. So one way to forego that is to use language. For example, you could simply say ta ta ta, or you could use an entire word or an entire sentence, like, for example, please come back, please come back. And you can think, please come back, please come back. Or, for example, you could say, I am here, I am here. And by assigning silly sentences like that to each note, you make sure that there's a separate impulse that goes from your brain to your finger to actually press and repeat that note. And there is a higher chance that you will actually play the repetition compared to if you were not using language. Another trick that I want to mention is one that is a little bit harder to explain. It is to think slow. So even if the tempo is fast, try to think at a slower pace. Try to imagine yourself playing the repetitions at a slower tempo than you actually are. Very often when we get a bit nervous, and especially when we get into difficult passages, we tend to just move forward, and then we tend to rush too much, which then makes it impossible to play. So try to imagine that you're playing it slightly slower than you actually are, because that way you might ensure that you'll actually play it at the right tempo. Also, sometimes, especially if it's a long passage of repetitions, I like to start slightly slower than I should, just in order to get into the repetitions. And once I'm in them, I increase the tempo and get to the actual tempo that I want to play. So it's very subtle. It's just a slightly slower start, but I find that it helps, because if you just start and already are stuck, it's very hard to get out of that. So I like to make sure that my beginning is very safe and secure, so slightly slower, and then I get into the fast tempo. I just want to mention at this point that you can also practice repetitions away from the piano, on the table, for example. You could just use a wooden surface or any surface basically and practice this motion that I was talking about. So not the, but wa-da-dum, ba-da-dum. Please come back. I am here. I am here. So just to make sure that you get this feeling of repeating the fingers while you make one arm movement. You can already practice that away from the piano. And then I just want to make a short section of this video where I talk about repetitions using the same finger. So as I said, I think the advice that you will hear the most is to actually change fingers while playing repetitions. It usually makes things easier. However, there are certain moments where using the same finger might work for you as well. And what I want to mention is, if you do that, the movement on the key is so important and will be so helpful, as well as the one motion while you play the repetition. So again, don't go dum dum dum, but go wap-a-bum, wap-a-bum. And I think instances where the same finger repetition might be helpful is if it's a very short group. So if it's maybe 2 or 3 repeated notes, and then you continue on going in a phrase. I've had some Bach pieces, for example, where I've used that method. But if you have long repetitions, I think that you really will use the changing the fingers method rather than the same fingering. In general, once you get to know all of these different fingerings, and once you try them and practice them in the right way with the right hand and finger position, you will find out what works best for you. I think this is really something that differs from hand to hand. It depends on how you're built, how your fingers are built, how your hand is built, how your arm is built. So it really is up to you to find out what works best for you, whether you're a 3-2-1, 3-2-1 person, a 4-3-2-1 person, just a 2-finger person, maybe 2-1-2-1, or maybe even the same finger. It's really up to you to find out what works best. Personally, for me, if I have long repetitions, I like to do 3-2-1 or just 2-1. I'm not a friend of the 4-3-2-1, but that's just me. It really depends on how your hand is built. So try out all of these different combinations and find out what works best for you. Also, please leave it in the comments down below which method you've been using the most up to now, or maybe which method you are just now discovering and would like to look into more, which type of fingering you are. And before I end this video, I just want to put in a little disclaimer that also you really should keep in mind that the piano and the instrument that you are using has certain limitations when it comes to fast repetitions. So if you are really feeling that it is simply impossible to play repetitions on your instrument, it might not be your fault, but it might actually be the fault of the instruments. Upright pianos, for example, don't have as great repetitions as grand pianos, and also within the grand pianos, there are big differences. So just keep in mind that there are limits to your instrument. However, now I'm really already speaking about fast tempo repetitions. Slow repetitions anyone can do on any instrument. And also a help could be to find what I like to call the repetition point of the key. So there is a point where you know exactly how high you have to lift the key in order to press it again and for the sound to come back. So it's not necessary to really have big pauses in between the keys in order for the repetition to work. It can also be very subtle, very minimal movement. So really try to find out where the repetition point is on your piano and try to find that and play with it in order to create the fastest possible repetition. I hope that you found this video helpful. Let me know if there are any other methods that you use in order to practice repetitions, if you have any mental tricks or tips that people can implement in order to make repetitions easier. And I will be very interested to read all your comments down below. I really love it when you comment, and I really love to hear all of your different views and opinions and ideas. It's one of my favorite things about making these videos. And thank you so much for watching. If you liked it, please like the video and subscribe to my channel. That would help me a lot. And I will see you again in my next video next week. Bye.